Yeah, this video is long overdue. I got stuck no life grinding a certain amount in a certain game.
Such
time loss.
This was not my intention.
On with the show. After the success of Dark Souls 1, From Software began production on a sequel to the game. At the time, however, the director for Dark Souls 1, Hidetaka Miyazaki, had his hands full developing Bloodborne and thus gave the director roles to Tomohiro Shibuya and Yui Tanimura. Miyazaki wanted to remain as hands-off as possible to let the new director's creativity flow through the project, but around halfway through the current state of the game was deemed undesirable and Tomohiro Shibuya was booted from the role as director, if not the game as a whole. Yui Anumura, now being the sole director, rewrote the narrative and the world. This meant that what had already been made at this point had to be scrapped and refitted as best as possible. This would explain why Dark Souls 2 has and always will split the community when talking about it. Some think it's but a shell of Dark Souls 1, or a shell of its former self if you will, while others deem this as the best Souls games to date. Needless to say, with this in mind, the game was released to lukewarm reception but has still managed to garner a sizable fanbase ever since. At the very least, it was a financial success to such a degree that it got 3 DLCs and a technical revision in the Scholar of the First Sin release of the game. Speaking of which, there are 2 versions of Dark Souls 2, the original release with its 3 DLCs and the Scholar of the First Sin edition that includes all of the DLCs but has changed many aspects of the game, with the most notable thing being different enemy placements. Some short early game examples would be the knights in Hades Tower of Flame, the dragon, and the turtle armor looking knights being added into the Force of the Lost Giants. The Pursuer also appears in many locations that weren't in the original game. Some item locations have been swapped around, most notably Estus Flash shards, more on what they do later. There are several more NPC invasions in Scholar of the First Sin edition, and as a final thing, you don't spawn with the DLC key items, but you have to find them in various places around the world. The Scholar of the First Sin edition also changed the game's textures quality and made some places a lot darker than in the original to give the torch item more use. I've heard that while Scholar of the First Sin edition adds new lore and NPCs, all of these would be unlocked in the original if you own all of the game's DLC, but I don't know how true that statement is. All in all, there aren't that many differences between either game. A unique complaint I've heard every now and then is that some of the enemy placements in the Scholar of the First Sin edition doesn't make any sense. That is to say, certain enemies that has no place being in a certain area due to lore reasons are now, well, present, and that might break your immersion or just the lore in general. If this will bother you, then the original is the no-brainer pick, but other than that, you can't go wrong with either. Look at the visual differences and pick accordingly if that's an important factor to you, or go by the cheapest price if none of these previous points is much of a concern. The intro of this game is weird to say the least. It doesn't do much of anything other than to name drop Drangleic, the land that the game takes place in. Other than that, it's the same "you're undead, so you better get some souls to not go hollow" that's been repeated in a lot of dialogue from the first game. The giant vortex you see at the end of the cinematic is never explained and has been speculated upon ever since. The most logical interpretation is that it's a portal and thus the reason why you spawn directly into the things betwixt even before you've created your character. That's right, character creation comes after you've already gained control of the character. Moving on to the story side of things, it's quite simple all things considered. At the start of the game, your character is hollowing, but upon reaching a cabin with several old firekeepers, they give your character some gold to attach to as to prevent the hollowing process, be it intentional on their part or not, and that is to break the curse of the undead.
All people come here for the same reason, to break the curse. You're no different, I should think. Doesn't stand a chance. Well, you never know.
This goal makes you explore all over Drangleic, and along that journey you come across great souls from several of the game's bosses. These strong souls will eventually attract Aldia, an old scholar that tried to break the curse who sees potential in you and sends you away to find the king of the land, Vendrick.
No one has come this far, not for a very long while. Your honor, you wish to share this curse? Then accept defeat of your ilk, and face the trials that await you. And yes, you have already joined the crestfallen. Young Hollow, there are but two paths. Inherit the order of this world, or destroy it. Only a true monarch can make such a choice. Very few indeed have come even this far. And yet your journey is far from over. Outgrown Hollow, have you what it takes? Truly. Young Hollow, seek after Vendrick. He who almost became a true monarch. The Vendrick is certain to guide your way. Fledgling Hollow, may we meet again?
Going through his castle and later into the crypts, you will find Vendrick there who has gone hollow. In this pile of armor, you find a ring that allows you to go through many locked giant doors that you've seen in your journey, one leading into Aldia's Keep that's also attached to the Dragon Eyrie. Meeting with the Dragon Leader here, you will gain the Ashen Mist Heart that allows you to visit memories of the deceased or hollow. Using the heart on the many deceased giants in Drangleic would reveal the war that was had between them and Vendrick. Using the heart on Vendrick, you'll gain a chance to interact with him where he reveals that there are other fallen kings with crowns of great power.
Seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. I am Vendrick, ruler of Drangleic. Seeker of fire, deliverer of crowns. What do you see in the flames? Find the crowns and your own answers. The crowns hold the strength of lords from times long past. Seek adversity, as befits you, seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. Seeker of fire, conqueror of dark. I too sought fire once. With fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. A lie, but I knew no better. Seeker of fire, you know not the depth of dark within you. It grows deeper still, the more flame you covet. Flame, oh, flame. I am king of this wretched, unraveled kingdom. I subdued the giants and claimed their strength, so that I might step closer to fire. Drangleic will fall, the fire will fade, and the souls of old will re-emerge. With dark unshackled, a curse will be upon us, and men will take their true shape.
After many great battles and deadly locations, you manage to find all 4 crowns, and upon returning to Vendrick, he will bestow upon you his blessing, which prevents hollowing if you wear one of the crowns.
One day, fire will fade, and dark will become a curse. Men will be free from death, left to wander eternally. Dark will again be ours, and in our true shape, we can bury the false legends of yore. Only, is this our only choice? Seek strength.
Now that you're a true monarch in everything but name, it is time to take the throne for yourself. After dispatching the Throne Watchers, you're interrupted by Nashandra, the Queen of Drangleic, who's been corrupted by the Dark.
Brave undead, you have proven yourself to me. Now, be one with the dark.
After defeating her, Aldia makes another appearance where he tests your resolve.
Many monarchs have come and gone. One drowned in poison, another succumbed to flame. Still another slumbers in the realm of ice. Not one of them stood here. As you do now. You, conqueror of adversities. Give us your answer.
Once you've taken care of Aldea, you have two choices to make. Extend the Age of Fire yet again by taking the throne, or try and form a new way of life with the power of the crowns in hand.
I lost everything, and remain here, patiently. The throne will certainly receive you. But the question remains. What do you want? Tell me. Light, dark, or something else entirely? There is no path. Beyond the scope of life, beyond the reach of dawn. What could possibly await us? And yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate.
Honestly, the game story is pretty good. It has that somewhat generic yet very classical chosen one archetype going on. I don't think it's as unique as the other games, but it's not bad by any means. With that said, it doesn't fit very much with the other games. The other stories have been much darker than this one. Just looking at the games prior, in Demon's Souls you can take control of the old one to doom the world or put it back into its slumber, but it's heavily theorized that you become a monumental to do so, effectively giving up your independence in the process. In Dark Souls 1 you have the option to link the fire, but even then the fire will inevitably need to be linked again or bring about the Age of Dark, which will mutate all living things. Meanwhile in Dark Souls 2 you effectively have the acting like a sheep ending by linking the fire, or with the DLCs in hand the optimistic ending of carving a new path without the fire or the dark with the power of the crowns. Before the DLCs were released, the endings were the same as Dark Souls 1, where you either link the fire or embrace the dark. But at that point the very existence of these sequels proves that embracing the dark in the first game isn't a permanent solution either, as someone else will link the fire eventually. After this game, both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 didn't have any certified good endings either. While that may not be an issue in and of itself, it's quite telling that there was a different director involved in the project who wanted to take the series in their own direction. As I said earlier, before you get to create a character you can control them for a while. It's an odd design choice that doesn't serve much purpose. Oh well. Character creation is much the same as the other games. You get to pick your class that all have different starting stats and loadouts, and just like in the first game you get to pick a starting gift. Oh boy, starting gifts. Much like in the first game, some of these gifts are completely outclassed by the other ones or outright useless. A brand new player could reasonably deduce that the human effigy and homeward bone gifts aren't worth picking, as there must be more of them somewhere in the game. Like in the first game, if the player wants something that has a stated effect, they also won't pick the seed of a tree of giant or the petrified something. That leaves 3 out of 7 gifts as viable options, as from there it's up to what the player wants. The life ring is kinda whatever, as it only increases your HP by 5%, but if you're extremely lucky, it lets you live an attack that will otherwise kill you. The healing wares will give you 10 life gems, 3 radiant life gems and 1 old radiant life gem, along with 3 poison moss. Needless to say, when the game was initially released, this seemed like a tempting option, as Dark Souls had a reputation for being incredibly difficult, so you couldn't go wrong with some extra healing. That you get some items to cure poison is a nice bonus. Lastly, we had the bonfire aesthetic that would seem scary for a new player, as this item increases an area's game cycle by 1. That is to say, if you used a bonfire aesthetic in the things betwixt, the area would have all of the items and enemies that would be appropriate for a New Game Plus playthrough. It does however say on the tin to pick it if you want a challenge. All in all, many of the starting gifts are bad or lackluster as a new player. Some are guaranteed to have been made for more veteran players, like the seed of a tree of giants or the petrified something. When the giant seed is used, it will make invaders hostile to the area's monsters, but the day the servers die, this item will be completely useless, but of course that was never the intention when making it, so it's an unfair comparison. The petrified something can be given to the crows in the Things Betwixt to get various high tier items or even weapons. Most veterans pick this choice just for the amazing item pool. It's even better that you can redeem it at the start of the game. Then again, this leads into yet another problem. If you know how to use the petrified something, why pick any of the other gifts? None of the other gifts aside from maybe the bonfire aesthetic even comes close to the item pool of this trade. You can get the final upgrade step for common weapons by re-rolling until you get the Titanite slab super early in the game, or an extra petrified dragon bone to upgrade boss weapons. It has such a ridiculous amount of value attached to it compared to a few extra consumables or a PvP exclusive item, completely ridiculous balance. Going back to the character creator, none of the sliders are locked this time, so you can customize your character any way you want without any type of interference from the game itself. On top of that, you're finally able to see what all of the stats do right in the character creator. Now you can make whatever sort of character you think sounds the most enjoyable without going back to the Stone Age to read the manual or kill the pace of your playthrough by looking it up on the internet. While the issues of the starting gift balance remains, everything else about the character creator has been vastly improved from its previous iterations. Good job, B-Team! I don't have too much to say about the tutorial in this game. It does the job fine, like in the other games, where you get to go through it at your own pace, where the game shows you the controls through developer messages and they throw a few different enemy encounters at you. The one downside is that there's no boss in this area that you need to beat to progress. That is to say, there's nothing to assure the developers that you're ready for the rest of the game. Some might not even realize this was a tutorial area and went straight ahead into Majula. Considering that this most likely were a lot of people's first Dark Souls game, they barely know the controls and will be thrusted into the full game without having a good baseline about how the game operates. I suppose that, ironically enough, the freedom of choosing whether to do the tutorial or not only shows why the very first area of the game should be short yet handholdy. If the tutorial is short and linear, veterans can rush through it without issue, but if you can skip it altogether, then it can potentially harm new players as they might skip it, be it intentionally or by accident. The easiest way to fix the tutorial area will be to put a boss at the end before you get to enter Majula. That way, even if new players miss the entire area, they still had some sort of roadblock to make sure they're ready for what's ahead. Of course, a tutorial boss wouldn't be any issue for a veteran player. This is also a better idea than being able to skip the tutorial like in Demon's Souls after you played through it once. By being able to skip the tutorial, you would have to make a whole separate area that disconnected from the rest of the world, or it wouldn't be skippable. Oh boy, this is a long one as Dark Souls 2 introduced or changed a lot of core systems from the first game. Let's talk about something you will use throughout the game: healing items. In Dark Souls 1, you could heal either by using an Estus Flask or a Humanity, and that was it. In this game, you can heal by using an Estus Flask or various grades of light gems that heal you slowly over time. Honestly, this system isn't bad on paper, as instead of having a full heal from Humanities if you run out of Estus, you now have slow healing items, so you have to plan around when and how to use them in a fight. Unfortunately, they for some reason decided to make healing with Estus take way longer than in the first game. We're not only talking about the speed it takes for your health to go back up again, but also the time it takes to chug an Estus. They had the bright idea of tying Estus chugging speed with the agility stat. That means agility is vital to increase or you will die from not using your healing consumables in time. Of course, you might still die even if you play your cards right, as the time it takes to get healed by the Estus takes forever. Before continuing, yes, I know divine blessings exist, but they are incredibly limited and not a reliable way to heal. Hence, I didn't include them in what healings available to the player. Now, another way they changed Estus Flasks is that you no longer spend a resource to increase the quantity of them at bonfires. In Dark Souls 2, you have to find Estus Flask shards throughout the world and give them to the Emerald Herald to fix them for you. I've never been a fan of this system. On repeated playthroughs, this means that you either have to memorize or have a website open with all of the locations for the shards, along with the same thing of where the potency upgrades are located. A lot of the time it feels like you have to go out of your way to get these things, even though you'd rather just keep making progress. Unfortunately, this became a staple to the series afterwards. Another change to this game is the weapon and armor durability system. In Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, your weapon and armor degraded slowly over time with use, but in Dark Souls 2 they degrade much more rapidly and are at risk of breaking the longer you go without resting at a bonfire. In this game, you don't periodically repair your gear whenever you reach a blacksmith or when the game tells you it's at risk of breaking, but instead you only need to pay a repair cost if it actually breaks. The durability of an item is fully replenished when you rest at a bonfire unless it's broken. In an attempt to make the repair system something you'd actually pay attention to from time to time, they heavily reduce the durability of items. In fact, you can see the durability of your weapons at all times by this bar right under their icon. This system was infamous for a long time as the rate at which weapons upgraded was calculated by how many frames it was in contact with an enemy's body during the attack animation. Now, consider that the console versions of the game ran at 30 FPS but the PC port ran at 60 FPS with the same frame counting code, and you can see where the issue arises. This meant that if you played on a decent PC that could handle the game at 60 FPS, your weapon would break twice as fast. Absolutely incredible. This bug was in the game for over an entire year. It wasn't fixed until consoles got the Scholar of the First Sin version of the game that ran at 60 FPS even there. A fantastic change that became a staple to the series is that boss weapons are unlocked behind arbitrary upgrades of other weapons. Instead, there are 2 NPCs who will offer different kinds of weapons or spells in exchange for a boss soul. While you might need to go between them to see what they have to offer with your current set of boss souls, it is by far a friendlier system to new and veteran players alike with how straightforward it is. No longer do you need to plan your playthrough around upgrading a specific weapon and getting all of its upgrade materials. At most, you only need to look up what boss you need to kill if you have trouble remembering where a specific weapon comes from. You won't lose access to different features upon becoming hollow, but you will instead lose a tiny bit of max HP every time you die until the hollowing has been reversed by using a human effigy. This change is straight up dumb and a bit counterintuitive to the core philosophy of the game. If you're stuck on a boss, your health will always fluctuate between attempts, and while this small decrease in health might seem negligible, it will eventually reach a point where attacks that you used to be able to survive will start to kill you instead. If the breakpoints for attacks become unpredictable, it will hamper your ability to properly build up a good muscle memory. While you shouldn't try to get hit by attacks, there's a certain calmness to the fact that some attacks won't end your run right then and there if you happen to mess up. Now that potentially even the weakest of attacks can become a deadly strike, it puts a lot of pressure on you. It's one thing to fight a boss where mistakes are allowed, and another thing to fight a boss that requires complete concentration for several minutes without errors. Not to mention that this will likely only happen on bosses that you find difficult to fight already. Now they are made even worse as no mistakes are allowed. This is, of course, if you run out of human effigies, which is a possibility as they are a semi-limited resource. Okay, so what do I mean by semi-limited? Theoretically, you can get an infinite amount of human effigies as they are dropped from several enemies, but the drop rates are low and most people dislike needless grinding. Not to mention that enemies can despawn in this game if you don't know what you're doing. That's where the semi comes in, as you can grind an infinite amount of them, but if you want to buy them instead, there's only a limited amount of human effigies available throughout the game. There's a big reason why the other games in the series only reduce your health by a set amount once or not at all, instead of the health drop being infinite yet gradual. It just messes with the player in the long run. Unlike the first game where you needed the Lord Vessel to teleport to a set amount of bonfires, in this game you can teleport to any bonfire encounter from the very start. Some see this as a weakness as Dark Souls 2 isn't as interconnected as its predecessor, but I think it's more of a strength than anything else. You save a ton of time from what would otherwise be backtracking, and it minimizes the amount of weird convenience the world has to have for everything to be interconnected. It's good that some areas are far away and not connected back to something you've already seen, as it makes them actually feel like they're far away and remote. It doesn't have the fish tank effect from the first game. I usually don't cover online related material in these games, mostly because the servers are still down, but Soul Memory serves a special mention. So a short rundown of how the first game handled online matchmaking is that it tried to match your character's level with other similarly leveled characters in a specific range. This did not, however, prevent someone from beating the entire game if they were skilled enough and then invading other low-level players with far better equipment than they could ever hope to get early on into the game. In an attempt to prevent this thing from happening, and possibly even to let more experienced PvPers face each other more often, the soul memory system was implemented. It works by looking at the total amount of souls that your character has gained and then puts you in one of these brackets where you can only invade people with a similar soul memory to your own. This idea sounds great on paper until you take a step back and realize that most of the community likes to sit at a specific level for PvP in an attempt to encourage build variety. Down here, there's a lot of potential cheese. Up here, everyone has the same build due to the high stats and gamers' inability to not min-max something to death, and around here, the level 150 mark is a sweet spot for a healthy metagame. The developers also realized the system was hot garbage when put into action and added the Agape ring to the Skull of the First Sin patch that consumes all of the souls you would get from killing something, thus making it impossible for your soul memory to go up. Something that I mentioned earlier is the fact that enemies can permanently despawn. If you kill an enemy enough times, they are gone for good. I assume this was implemented in case a player was stuck on a boss or on a specific area for an obscenely long time. In that regard, I think it's an okay mechanic. It might go against the spirit of the game a bit, but the player still has to kill this enemy about 15 to 20 times to make it go away. Clearly, they can beat this particular mob without much issue at that point. The issue with this system comes from the fact that some mobs drop rare items, be it armor, weapons or what else, and if you don't manage to get that drop before the enemy despawns for good, then you either have to try again in New Game Plus, use a bonfire aesthetic, or make a new character. Yet again, this was deemed such a big issue that they made it so that the Covenant of Champions disabled this mechanic entirely when part of the Covenant. Of course, not a whole lot of people want to play through the game in this Covenant as it makes the game more difficult, but it's pretty much required to join if you want a specific drop. Speaking of the Covenant of Champions, I want to make a special note about it as it's completely unique to the series. This Covenant essentially serves as a hard mode for the game as it's located in the hub area of the game, Majula, and makes the game more difficult. If you join this Covenant, enemies will deal more damage, up to 50%, have more HP, gain a roughly 20% damage resistance, and increase the range at which enemies will spot you. You're basically playing New Game Plus while being on your first playthrough. On top of the harder enemies, they can no longer despawn, and it disables cooperative play along with disabling the ability to summon NPC phantoms. Meanwhile, players can still invade your world. Besides the added difficulty, there are rewards and ranks to the Covenant. By killing enemies and bosses, they can drop Awe Stones, and if you get 50 of them, you get the Vanquisher Seal that increases your unarmed attack power and turns your fists into deadly weapons. It's a cool reward for a difficult challenge. One last thing that came to mind that is not a cool enough reward for how ridiculous of a challenge these things are, we've got the Illusionary Ring of a Conqueror and Illusionary Ring of the Exalted. The Conqueror Ring makes anything in your left hand invisible, while the Exalted Ring makes anything in your right hand invisible. And how do you get them? Oh, through very simple tasks, of course. For the Illusionary Ring of the Conqueror, you just have to beat the entire game without dying, and for the Illusionary Ring of the Exalted, you have to clear the entire game without resting at a bonfire. All to make your weapons invisible at the cost of 1 or 2 ring slots. What a fantastic reward! With that said, it's neat that these rings are even in the game to begin with and have such a difficult unlock requirement. This is a reason why people love this game. The albeit nonsensical yet real rewards scattered throughout the game. I'm sure achievement hunters are glad that the ring achievements from Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 3 weren't a staple to the series. To start off, I'll assume the starting point of the game to be Majula as that's the hub. Everything will connect to it at one point or another, and the player will always come back here from time to time. Assuming that Majula is the starting point, without killing a boss, the player has access to things betwixt, Forest of Falling Giants, and Hades Tower of Flame. If you grind either to buy the Cat's Ring or to have enough HP to survive the falls in Majula's pit, you'll also have access to the Grave of Saints and the Gutter, and could serve as another opener, albeit it requires a tiny smudge of game knowledge. The Gutter contains 2 fragment branches of yore, and thus the areas of Shaded Woods and Shaded Ruins are reachable. Theoretically speaking, a player could reach Drangleic Castle through the Shrine of Winter if they have a soul memory of 1 million, but that will require hours of grinding, and without the knowledge or the changes to the Covenant of Champions, this task would most likely be outright impossible. Another way to unlock Shrine of Winter is to kill the 4 old ones, who are specific bosses in the other areas of the game. Without killing a boss, this would be the full extent of the game. 8 different areas and a theoretical 9th if the player grinds for an eternity. After this, there's sadly not much more leeway in terms of routing, as nearly every location requires a boss to be killed. There's no direct path to any of the old ones, and they all have a similar amount of bosses and/or areas you need to go through. To reach the Lost Sinner, the player can either go through the Forest of Fallen Giants and kill the last giant to get the Soldier's Key that's needed to confront the Pursuer in the same area. From there, they can be transported to Lost Bastille, where they need to beat the Ruined Sentinels to finally get into the area where the Lost Sinner resides. That's 2 areas and 3 bosses to gain access to Sinner's Rise. Alternatively, the player can reach Lost Bastille by going through Hades' Tower of Flame and kill the Dragon Rider to reach No Man's Wharf, where you have to kill the Flexside sentry to use the pirate ship. So instead of going through only 2 areas to reach Sinner's Rise, the player now needs to traverse 3 with the same amount of bosses present. At the very least, it's a different route open to the player. To reach the Iron Keep where the old Iron King resides, you first need to beat the boss in Hades' Tower of Flame and exhaust the dialogue of the Miracle Merchant after the Dragon Rider boss or kill her. She has an item that will open up the passage to Huntsman's Copse, where you have to defeat the Skeleton Lords to gain access into Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak. Lastly, you need to kill Mytha to get into Iron Keep. Once again, that's 3 bosses but 4 areas instead of 3. Very similar. To get into Brightstone Cove where Freya resides, you first need to get a fragment branch of Yor to get into Shaded Woods and then beat Nudgka in the Shaded Ruins to reach the Doors of Pharaohs, and lastly kill the Prowling Magus and his congregation to get into Brightstone Cove. While it's only 2 bosses this time, it's counterweighted by the fact that you have to enter a minimum of 4 areas to even get here. The one exception to all of the other old ones is the Rodden, who you only need to traverse the gutter and the Black Gulch to reach. 2 areas, no bosses. And that's what I meant with most of them being similar in terms of area length or boss amount. Listing them up, we have Freya, 2 bosses and 5 areas. Lost Sinner, 3 bosses and 3 or 4 areas depending on the route. Old Iron King, 3 bosses and 5 areas. And finally, the Rodden, with 0 bosses and 2 areas required to reach him. Of course, depending on the route, a boss and area will be knocked off from the Lost Sinner or Old Iron King, as both share the requirement of going through Hades' Tower of Flame. All in all, if you only want to reach a specific boss early, the early game routes aren't too bad. They're pretty even in terms of what you need to go through, and thus you won't be missing a whole lot of the game to get your wanted boss soul. Hell, you could keep all of the bosses alive if you decide build is locked behind the Shrine of Winter requirement. Yes, 1 million in soul memory is a crap ton of farming and souls, but at least it's possible to keep the rest of the game relatively untouched. In fact, the rest of the game shares a similar length for every boss in the late game. Assuming you get the Shrine of Winter in the least amount of areas possible, namely the Gutter and Shaded Woods, and from there farm the 1 million souls required to open the Shrine of Winter, you only need to beat 3 bosses to reach Vendrick, and from there 1 to reach the Ancient Dragon, who in turn unlocks additional areas in the form of memories. From here to reach the ending of the game, you only need to beat the Giant Lord to get into the Throne of Want, where you fight a couple of different bosses depending on what you've done in the game, and you're done. All this is to say that if you grind the 1 million souls to unlock the Shrine of Winter, you will in total need to beat 5 bosses and go through 9 areas to reach the final pair of bosses in the game. It's a bit longer than the others in the previous list, but it's still not too bad, all the grinding aside. Now, I don't know why you would spend all that time grinding to take this route, but you can. To further complicate the routing in this game, the DLC areas are scattered about in different shrines. One is at the end of the Iron Keep, another at the end of the Black Gulch, and one is in the Shrine of Winter. I won't go into detail about how to get all of the items to make the shrines operational, but the most important things to know is that the Black Gulch shrine that leads into the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, you need to find the key in the Black Gulch, and then open a door in the Pit of Majula. For the shrine in Iron Keep that gives you access to the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC, you get it from a pit full of flame lizards in the Forest of Fallen Giants. You can survive the fall down to them or get a key in the Iron Keep itself to unlock a door to it. Lastly, to gain access to the Crown of the Ivory King DLC, you can find the key item in Drangleic Castle, which will make the Shrine of Winter operational. Since the Shrine of Winter is the most difficult to unlock without clearing most of the game, it's more difficult to get desired items from that DLC, but the other 2 are located in quite easy to reach areas. One final thing to cover is a new item unique to this game that could be a potential game changer, the bonfire aesthetic. I touched upon this before, but it can do a lot of things for routing in this game, as you gain access to future game cycle items without needing to beat the entire game. There are far too many items to count where this could be useful, but just some of them would be, for example, getting the Moon Butterfly set by using an aesthetic in Majula, getting the Katarina set, aka Onion Armor, in the Forest of Fallen Giants, getting rings from various bosses such as the Chloranthe ring +2 from the Executioner's Chariot. One thing to make a note of with the bonfire aesthetic is that you must have killed the area's boss to be able to use them, so some consideration is needed before forcing an area to advance to a new game cycle. It's a unique system with a lot of potential for more experienced players to toy around with, and I wish it was kept in for Dark Souls 3. To conclude this section, while the game might seem a bit linear on the surface and is not at all as close to being as interconnected as the first game's world, the routing is still open and has a lot of different ways the game can be tackled. I was thoroughly surprised by this, as in my mind the game seemed more restrictive. The design of the base game is a downgrade from its predecessor. Areas are far more linear and rarely connect back onto itself again. There are of course some exceptions, like the breakable wall in the Forest of Fallen Giants that opens up a shortcut to and from the bonfire in the area, and the door you can unlock from the other side that acts as a shortcut to the Pursuer. Other than that, nothing comes to mind of levels looping back into previous areas. There's probably something like this in the gutter, but the place is so dark it's hard to tell, and for me to remember if you ever go back the way you came from. It doesn't help that I also have a terrible sense of direction. The Iron Keep has like one alternate path you could take, but it's just that, an alternate path. Perhaps this is why the game feels linear while the potential routing allows you to tackle the game in plenty of ways, because the areas themselves are heavily linear. In a way, there's not much depth to them, as the game has a hard time using verticality to its advantage. There's no similar awe-inspiring use of it like with the rafters in Anor Londo or the albeit confusing yet brilliant catacombs where you can see the bridges on several different floors or you fall straight through the ground to a lower level and so on. In a sense, there's no choice given to the player on what to do or try in order to advance. If the level loops back onto itself, you might not have taken the correct path, but you get some kind of reward out of it and you know where you are in relation to the rest of the level, so making your way back would be easy. Dark Souls 2 on the other hand has a lot of dead ends where you need to backtrack to try and make progress. Even if you get something good out of taking the alternate path, you're still met with a dead end and are forced to go back the way you came in a more unsatisfying way. Thankfully, the dev team realized this when they designed the DLCs for the game. All of them use verticality in a much better way, both in the areas themselves and to create a good scenery. In the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, you will have a beautiful shot overlooking the area as you enter and use verticality and exploration tool inside of the Aztec pyramid looking buildings. Look, I have no idea what these things are called, but they're cool. Hell, the entire point is to reach the bottom to unlock a bridge so you can go to the top of one of the buildings only to go back down again. You bounce down, up and down again, which isn't present in the base game. In the Crown of the Iron King, they start you off at a high verticality, and as you make your way into the area by walking on a giant chain. From this viewpoint, you can make out some outer areas you'll get to explore later. Much the same, it uses the vertical plane as you're meant to go all the way down the tower. As the Crown of the Ivory King DLC doesn't use verticality all too much in its level design, but for the viewing pleasure. At a shrine where you get a key item, you can overlook the rest of the area, and when you enter the final boss room, you jump down a hole into the castle that drastically shifts the atmospheric color palette as you enter the Nest of Chaos. Even if verticality isn't used as well as I had hoped, there are areas I like. Forest of the Lost Giants is a good beginner area with plenty of shortcuts to find, and it does use verticality every now and then. No Man's Wharf has this neat outlaws or pirate vibe going on, which is a bit open compared to the other areas. You have plenty of small buildings to explore and certain doors that you have to open from the other side and whatnot. Aldia's Keep has some cool set pieces like the return of a mirror that one of the bosses uses. Here you can see the animation they use to get out of the mirror. It also has a giant dragon skeleton at the start and some creatures Aldia probably kept for experimentation like this giant basilisk and a troll. But that goes for most of the areas I like in the base game. They're not good from the virtue of being fun to explore, but by having cool set pieces or lore implication that sets them apart from the rest of the areas in the game. I don't have much else to say about the level design. It gets the job done leading your way through the various areas of the game, but outside the DLC there's much to be desired from the usage of smart backtracking and side paths along with the lack of vertical design. Oh yeah! This game has quests that flow similarly to the first game where you keep encountering the same NPCs along your journey throughout Drangleic, but patches isn't in this game so they suck. At least there's one homie among the crowd, know what I'm saying?
I, Gavlan. Gavlan will, Gavlan deal.
Like with the system changes, we arrive yet again at a controversial set of changes for the game's combat. All of the basic tools from the previous games present such as light attack, heavy attack, kick, parry, backstab, jump attack, but new to this series is the guard break riposte. Very simple mechanic, if you break someone's guard you can riposte them back for massive damage. A small yet nice addition to combat. The issue lies with this tiny stat that's incredibly counterintuitive known as agility. Okay, so what's so bad about it? Let's go back a small step and look at two fundamental yet very important actions in the first game, using Estus and rolling. Chugging Estus uses a set amount of frames every single time so you can have an idea of when it's safe to use. The same goes for rolling. When you roll, you will get a set amount of invulnerability frames depending on how heavy your character is and certain items. It's all very simple stuff and makes sense as you will build muscle memory for when it's viable to use either of these basic gameplay features. In Dark Souls 2, this idea of consistency is completely thrown out the window as both chugging, Estus and rolling is now tied to the agility stat. Yes, there's a stat that improves your invulnerability frames. I don't know what the hell they were thinking. Let me explain why this is a complete nightmare to try and balance. There are known thresholds for invulnerability frame increase based on your agility. Let's say we have two players, player A and player B. Player A starts at 85 agility and has no idea how to increase this stat or what it does. They have an incredible disadvantage compared to someone who does. Player B knows how to increase their agility stat and feels 105 agility is good enough for them. Now player B has more than double the invulnerability frames of player A. So where do you draw the line for how long enemy hurt boxes are going to be active? Should it be player A, as that's what they started the game with, and in the spirit of the game you shouldn't be hampered by such a basic choice at the starting class that you might not be able to beat the game? Or should the balance be around player B, who knows a bit more about the intricacies behind stat management? Or should you go with option C and balance it around the highest amount of frames possible, namely 16? And that's where the nightmare of balance comes into play. If you balance it around players with 85 or even 86 agility, the game will likely become too easy. Now every attack is centered around a roughly 0.2 second long window to make it possible to dodge without being frame perfect, but that means if you increase agility to 105, you'll have over double the amount of time to dodge. On the flip side of things, if they try and balance it too high, like ironically 105 agility, all of the people under that benchmark will feel like they're getting hit even though they rolled perfectly. If you set the balance mark even higher than 105, everyone under that set agility number will have the same experience of the game feeling unfair and clunky. There are countless clips and gifs of people getting hit by attacks that make no sense, and this is due to the agility system. I don't understand how a developer can see this sort of thing happening while testing the game and think it's good enough to keep in. I almost wonder if it's a time constraint issue, as there just so happens to be an enemy in the game with a questionable running animation, but it's also the only one that would suggest any sort of issue during management, so I don't really know. Esther's chugging speed is also tied to agility. The total difference between 90 and 100 agility is 0.3 seconds, which might not seem like a huge deal, but when you compare the numbers, that's still a decreased chugging speed of 15%, which is huge. Especially in the middle of a fight where every second counts. One of the cornerstones in Dark Souls 1 was the fact that the game was fair yet challenging, but now the designers have put themselves in a corner as a player's feel and enjoyment of the game is locked behind a stat. Not to mention that it practically forces players to invest in stats they may not have any interest for. In my opinion, you're pretty much required to invest in attunement and adaptability, the two stats that affect agility, until you get up to 105 agility. Anything below that feels awful to play with, and getting more agility after that requires too many resources. They use the same spell system as the first game, where you have a set amount of cast that replenishes every time you rest at a bonfire. I have not much more to add, as the system was okay in the first game and is well okay here as well. One good thing is that the spell tracking has been improved, so you will no longer miss enemies that are slightly too short. One cool thing they did do with the combat is to add something known as power stancing. If you have two of the same type or very similar items such as claws and fist weapons equipped in both hands and also have stats equal that of 1.5 times the weapon's strength and dexterity requirements, you can power stance them. That is to say, if you have a katana that requires 10 strength and 20 dexterity to use, you need to have 15 strength and 30 dexterity to power stance with them. To stance, you just need to hold down triangle or Y depending on controller, and if your character makes a slight change in their pose, you're now power stancing. By power stancing, you get a completely new set of moves to use and look cool to boot. It's a fun thing to play around with, and it has even been brought back in Elden Ring. For all of the negatives this game gets, it did have some pretty damn cool ideas in it. And with that said, let's go into something negative about the game: the bosses. There are a total of 40 bosses in the game, but 11 of them are dudes in armor. That's roughly 28% of all bosses feeling samey on some level. Of course, it's fine to have people in armor as a boss, but they're overused in this game. If we look at Demon Souls, only 2 bosses were armor, and in Dark Souls 1 we only have 2 or 3 if we want to stretch it and add in the Iron Golem. They don't even have anything to thematically set them apart, unlike the bosses in Dark Souls 3. Just a few examples before to act more like an animal by moving around on all fours. The Dancer, who has unnaturally long limbs and move around in an eerie fashion, or something like Lothric, who rides on his brother's back and teleports the pair around. The only armored boss that somewhat stands out in Dark Souls 2 is the Pursuer, as he floats. Other than that, they start to feel the same after a while, even if their weapons are different. I can however live with that. A much bigger issue for me is the amount of bosses who summon in help during the fight, or adds as it's more commonly known as. Let's reverse this process a bit. In Demon Souls there are only 2 bosses who have any sort of adds, and in Dark Souls 1 there are also only 2. But in Dark Souls 2 there's an entire 10 bosses that either summon adds during the fight, start with adds, or are about beating adds. The Executioner's Chariot is primarily about fighting adds until you can one-shot the boss. Looking Glass Knight summons annoying high HP adds every now and then. I can however give this boss a pass, as the mirror mechanic is intended to summon invaders into your world, and that's a damn cool idea, even if a bit annoying. The Skeleton Lords summon adds every time you kill one of them, and you're required to clear all of the adds to beat the boss. Belfry Gargoyles are pretty much the boss of the first game, but instead of beating only 2 bosses you have to kill 5, and more than 2 can be active at once. Royal Rat Vanguard is also an ad clearing fight. You can however see the rat you need to kill as he sports a mohawk. A bit late to the party there, buddy. The Royal Rat Authority starts the fight with several rats. Freya starts the fight with several spider adds. Prowling Magus is just an ad clear fight. Elana can be a relatively easy boss or a difficult one, as she can spawn 3 skeletons who are easy to fight, or another boss in the game! I have no clue what the hell they were thinking here. Burnt Ivory King has a bunch of knights protecting him that won't stop spawning unless you find knights throughout the DLC area to help you. Simply put, you have to face this gauntlet of enemies every time you even want to attempt fighting the Ivory King, which means you more than likely will have used some, if not all, of your Estus before he even appears. So why don't I like bosses focusing around adds? And that is simple to answer. I want the boss to be challenging by itself, or have a healthy dynamic with its boss partner. In the first game, Artorias is deemed as a fantastic boss as he's challenging on his own. The same goes for Ornstein and Smough, who are a duo boss, but they've been properly built up as a challenge with the game's previous bosses as a base. See my video on Dark Souls 1 for more detail. The point is that these 2 bosses don't need extra help from regular enemies to pose some kind of threat. If there were a bunch of like dark mutated people in the Artorias fight, or some of the knights from Anor Londo in Ornstein and Smough's fight, they wouldn't be held to such a high regard and would be annoying to fight against. Even then, most of the bosses are also lackluster. Out of the 40 bosses in the game, the only ones I really enjoy fighting are the Lost Sinner, Velstadt, Dark Lurker, Sin, Fume Knight, Soralon, Ava, and Burnt Ivory King. That's only 8 bosses, 5 of which are from the DLCs. Needless to say, the base game missed the mark on the bosses, and is another reason why this game has such mixed opinions. Another issue with the bosses are some of the areas you fight in. The Ruin Sentinels arena requires you to take fall damage unless you got the cat ring. In Mipha's arena there's a circle of poison that will heal her if she stands in it and obviously hurts you. The Rotten has patches of fire everywhere and suffocates you for space. And finally, the Old Iron King has a random broken patch in this arena that makes it needlessly difficult to move around, and if you're aligned poorly will fall into it and die instantly. While not being an intrinsic part of combat, the movement in the game gets a special place in this section, as it sometimes gets in the way, albeit rarely. From replaying the game, I've noticed that the game rotates your character between 8 directions. It's very obvious when you run around in circles. Even though you make a perfect circle with the analog stick, your character will awkwardly snap between angles. While this might not seem like a big issue, it does sometimes cause you to not walk as you intend to. With that, I mean there's a small dead zone between every direction where your character won't turn that tiny bit extra which you might need for a precise movement. Again, it rarely causes issues, but it adds a bit of extra jank for no real reason. The atmosphere in Dark Souls 2 is both hit and miss. While it doesn't have the fine details of Demon Souls, it knocks Dark Souls 1 out of the park. The world actually feels big, and every area that's vastly different from one another has some sort of connector to deviate the change. Some examples would be to get from Hades Tower of Flame to No Man's Wharf, where you have to go through an underground system that leads into a broken wall where the cave of No Man's Wharf is located. From the Shrine of Winter to Drangleic Castle, you have a small passageway and a tunnel you have to go through before the rain starts to pour. It doesn't feel like it randomly appears from nowhere. For the gutter, you first have to drop down the pit in Majula and make your way further down a small underground system, and even in the gutter you can see trash coming down from the walls, which is most likely where its namesake comes from. The entire place is a trash pile. Although some of these connectors are good, others make no sense whatsoever. When going from Earthen Peak to the Iron Keep, you take an elevator up at the top of a windmill to reach a lava lake. I clearly don't need to go into detail as to how silly that is. Other than that, the atmosphere is fantastic. Majula starts to feel like a home after a while as you return to it so many times throughout the game, and with time more and more NPCs will make Majula their place of residence. It goes from a barren to quite a lively place as you make progress. The Forest of Fallen Giants is a deteriorating building of some kind and has a forest surrounding it. These trees off in the distance have all been born from the corpses of dead giants, hence the name of the area, but it also goes to show how much time has passed since this part of the world fell to decay. It must have taken decades for these trees to grow, and that would explain the state the area is currently in. The gutter has this makeshift build feel to it, as if the people who are stuck down here have used any and all trash they could find to build the area you traverse through. Going even deeper down into the black gulch, there's also these weird creatures that look alien as they live so far underground. While the connector to Dragon area is bad, the area itself looks fantastic. You can barely see the bottom as you're so far up that the clouds are obscuring your view down, and everything's connected by rickety bridges while dragons are constantly flying around you. It really feels like you're in some sort of dragon's nest far away from civilization. The first time you visit Drangleic Castle, it leaves one hell of an impact. The dark castle up the stairs looks foreboding, all the while as rain is pouring down hard and obscures the sunlight. They did a fantastic job with the atmosphere in most of these areas. The music in this game is weird. It's pretty much the only area of the game where the quality regressed with the game's DLCs. Before getting into that, I have to note that the rare tracks that are used for atmospheric purposes hit the nail on the head every time they're used. Majula's theme has this nostalgic and calming with a slight eerie undertone to it. All of these things fit together as this is your main hub of the game and will eventually become your home, but you're still trapped in this strange land that you most likely got to through a strange portal as shown in the opening cinematic. The nostalgic feel might be a nod to the player as they've been in a similar hub before, namely Firelink Shrine. When you find the hollowed King Vendrick, his theme invokes a sense of mystery with a creepy background noise accompanying it. From all accounts you've heard about this great king, you most likely didn't expect him to be hollow, hence the mysterious tone. Now, let's go into both some good and bad tracks from the base game. Let's start with the first boss the majority of players met, the Last Giant. This is supposedly the last giant in existence. He resides at the bottom of the keep in the area and might have seen most of his kind turn into the trees that surrounds the keep. It's a tragic story by all accounts, and he's got this track. Some might argue it is rage being displayed, but there's no tragic undertone or hint of what's been happening in the background. The giants are clearly sentient creatures if there's a lord among them and they decide to launch an invasion on Drangleic. It's really just epic for the sake of being epic. Along the way you will encounter a lot of lore insignificant bosses, and they get the Dark Souls 1 treatment of having epic soundtracks for the sake of being epic. Ruined Sentinels have a fantastic soundtrack, but it doesn't serve much purpose other than being epic. The same goes for something like the Skeleton Lords, and Royal Rat Vanguard. I hope you see my point, especially with the last one. However, for the lore significant bosses, they have a layer of depth to them and sometimes have soundtracks to enhance the arena you fight them in. The Lost Sinners track is creepy and heavy to give a clue to the broken and tortured spirit of the character, as her imprisonment and punishment is self-imposed. It also helps to enhance the dark prison cell that the fight takes place in. For Mytha, the baneful queen, her theme nods to her lore of gradual insanity from not gaining the affection from the old Iron King despite her beauty. One part even sounds like a downward spiral, which might be a further nod to this. The Pursuer sounds foreboding, as his goal is to hunt down others that have been cursed by the dark sign, namely other hollows. I do however think this track would have had more of an effect in the Scholar for Sin edition, when Pursuers appear more frequently and every time you would have been accompanied by this theme. Unfortunately, that's not the case. He gives a sense of dread that way, even if you don't see him initially spawn in, the music is gonna kick in. Sadly, some of these tracks still don't really hit the mark even though they're different. The Rodent's theme is one of those. Even though he's an amalgamation of undead bodies stuck together, his theme doesn't reflect the actual horror of such a concept well enough. To me, it sadly comes off as a worse Nido theme. Then we get to the DLCs. I want to note that I love these tracks. They are great pieces of music, but none of them enhance the boss itself in any capacity to their lore. They merely sound epic for the sake of being epic, and it's a shame as the base game already did a good job at some bosses. The songs I want to make the most note of is the last boss in the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, Sin, of bosses in the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC, Fume Knight, and Sir Alon. And finally, the Burnt Ivory King's theme. I would like to bring special attention to Ava's theme, as his theme might be connected to his lore. His duty is to guard the Ivory King's Child of the Dark from trespassers, so while Ava might not want to fight you, he has to out of obligation and loyalty to the Ivory King. It's a refreshing use of a song compared to the other DLCs. Or maybe they only wanted some sense of slight dread and mystery, as you can't see the boss until you get a key item, but who knows. Well, it would be easy to point at Yui Tanimura for every fault that I mention in this retrospective, as he's the sole director for Dark Souls 2 that will do him a disservice. At the very start I mentioned how he had to rewrite the world and had plenty of errors already done which had to be refitted as best as possible. From doing research during the making of this video, I've seen a few people note that this refitting of the game happened during the middle of development. This means that Tanimura tried to fully realize his ideas for Dark Souls 2 in effectively half of the total development time for the game, and with that in mind I have to say that it's incredibly impressive that the game is often considered as an inferior yet only slightly so game compared to Dark Souls 1. If anything, I'd say it only goes to show how truly competent Tanimura really is as a director. I think most of us can agree that the DLCs are the best parts of Dark Souls 2, and those were fully directed by Tanimura and shows what he's capable of when left to his own devices. He's also been co-director in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring since then, and those games are great. One last thing I would like to mention is that he might have been the main director for the Ringed City DLC in Dark Souls 3, which is my favorite DLC and one of my favorite areas in the Dark Souls trilogy. I can't find anything concrete, but I can imagine that he would have had a bigger role in the DLC, as the Ringed City DLC was first announced in 2017, the same year From Software's next game was announced, Sekiro. I think it's safe to say that Miyazaki spent most of his time with Sekiro, as it was a new IP and the quality of the game itself would imply such a thing. This will mean that Tanimura has made one of, if not the best area in the entire Dark Souls trilogy. It is truly unfortunate that Tanimura gets a lot of flack from the community when he, by all accounts, seemed to be a competent director just because of trying to salvage a game that was a complete train wreck when he took control over the project. In a sense, he's sorta like this guy when he saved this game from utter disaster. No wonder he's been a co-director ever since. To conclude, I find Dark Souls 2 to be an odd game that tries to be a follow-up to Dark Souls 1 while at the same time attempts to branch itself off from the very core that it tries to emulate. All of the items and game elements from Dark Souls are here, but they've been altered in minor or major ways to feel different for the sake of being different. There didn't exist a reason to tie invulnerability frames to stat, make Estus heal slower, give the player gradual decreased health every time they die and so on. but in other areas it works to the game's benefit, like being able to teleport from the start and having a straightforward uses or boss souls. I will fully admit that the base game completely missed the mark in most places, as the areas are linear with very little verticality and the very movement of the game feels awkward in comparison, along with a lot of the bosses feeling samey or have over-reliance on outside factors to make them more difficult. However, the director saw the player feedback and kept it in mind when making the game's DLCs, which are the highlights of the game. They look gorgeous and feel a lot closer to how a Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls area would play out in style and enemy placement. While a lot of the bosses are dudes in armor, which was a complaint in the base game, they are the very least more enjoyable to play against, but can still feel a bit samey at times in the DLCs. Other than that, in terms of atmosphere and music, the game respectfully holds up as a sequel, even though they dropped the ball in the music department in the DLCs. There's also a lot of odd charm to the game, as it has certain elements that never returned in the Souls series, such as the Covenant of Champions that effectively served as a hard mode, or the absurd requirements to get 2 rings that's completely designed as bragging rights. Bringing up my tier list over the games again, I'd say Dark Souls 2 is still ranked the same among all of these titles. I don't think it's a bad game after replaying it, but I don't think it's a very good game either. It's certainly not better than Dark Souls 3, that's for sure. When compared with its predecessors, there's just too many things different about it, from game changes to the general feel of the game, for it to fit in with the other games. I've said this to other people before, but I think if they made a completely unique world and cut all ties to Dark Souls, the game would probably have been received better within the community. Then it wouldn't be a sequel to Dark Souls, and then people wouldn't compare it as harshly to the games that came before. As it is now, people have and forever will compare it to a game that has the same gameplay loop but is fundamentally different in many mechanical areas with a completely different feel. I think it's safe to say that, deserved or not, Dark Souls 2 will forever remain as a black sheep in the Souls series. My name's Alexander, and thanks for watching all the way through. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to hear my opinions on other games. See you next time.